DSW 2310 Dual Diagnosis, Treatment and Assessment, The Past, the Present, and the Future. Chapter 1. A Handbook on Dual Diagnosis, 4th edition. What exactly is dual diagnosis? In the developmental sector, dual diagnosis is the existence of a developmental disability and a mental health disorder. There are two or more sets, comorbid, of issues coexisting in one person. History of dual diagnosis. Archives at HRC. Locked, secluded rooms in hallways underground, made of concrete with a small opening to pass food through. History of dual diagnosis. Archives at HRC. Locked, secluded rooms in hallways underground, made of concrete with a small opening to pass food through. Ancient history to mid-20th century. Developmental disabilities and mental health issues were one and the same, no differentiation. People with developmental disabilities and mental health issues were persecuted, devalued, and seen as defective. They were often killed to relieve society of the burden of care. Treatment and attitudes were varied. In the medieval times, persons with developmental disabilities and dual diagnosis were treated with kindness and seen as part of their community. Religious communities believed that God sent them so society could be tolerant and charitable. However, attitudes changed, and the belief was that they were possessed by demons or evil spirits. Lack of services. In the 1950s, major tranquilizers were discovered. Tranquilizers worked for people of all abilities, including persons with developmental disabilities. In the 1960s, the beginning of the behavior modification movement. Behavior modification was successful for people of all abilities, including persons with developmental disabilities. In the 1970s and 80s, the beginning of the deinstitutionalization movement. Previously, people with a dual diagnosis were locked up in institutions and wards, hidden from society. Late 18th and early 19th century. The emergence of the recognition of the difference between developmental disabilities, primarily intellectual deficit, and mental illness, emotional impairment. Early to mid-20th century. Gap widened between developmental disabilities and mental illness. Psychiatry had little or no interest in people with developmental disabilities. As early as the 1980s, this attitudinal barrier could still be found. Developmental disability was hypothesized to be physical or organic, and mental health was related to emotions or personality. In 1979, Gulacchieri, a psychiatrist, stated that psychiatry needs to reconsider its stance towards retarded people because a terrible barrier has grown up between the fields of mental health and mental retardation. As well, clinical psychologists appear to have a similar lack of interest in the emotional problems of people with developmental disabilities. In the last decade, we've seen the Social Inclusions Act of 2008, Facilities Closures, Deinstitutionalization, 2009. A History of Developmental Services in Ontario, 1876. Government of Ontario opened its first institution for people with a developmental disability. By 1968, the facility had 2,600 residents. Until the mid-1970s, the number of institutions and the number of people living in them continued to grow. By 1976, 2 years after the government passed the DSA, Ontario operated 16 institutions or facilities. 10,000 people with developmental disabilities received residential care. Commemorative plaque at Huronia Regional Centre. A video of the ceremony at HRC. Put the URL into your search bar and hit enter. Choose the first option. Settlement reach in Huronia class action lawsuit. Scroll down to the middle of the page. Commemorative plaque at Huronia. Watch a video of the ceremony. Hover over the arrow to watch the video. Barriers to services. Attitudes. Complexity of dual diagnosis. Myth of immunity. Myth that unusual behavior is natural and a result of mental retardation. Myth of primary diagnosis. Mental health versus developmental disability. People with disabilities were devalued, did not meet society benchmarks for success in academics, employment, physical well-being, etc., and met with prejudice, least desirable clients. People react negatively to persons with disabilities. It took months to arrive at a valid diagnosis and treatment plan, and it required a great deal of coordination and cooperation from professional and multidisciplinary teams. Immunity. People with DD were happy and mentally healthy, did not recognize as a mental health problem. Focus was on skills training and behavior management. Why bother with mental health treatment as they have a developmental disability? Intellectual deficit, medical, behavioral, social, emotional, physical challenges. Dual diagnosis is very complex. Most often it requires the collaboration of multidisciplinary teams, and it requires a coordinated approach.